Well, Rick asked me to speak tonight about some tools for having difficult conversations. There's a lot of pain in our world right now, very heartrending times for many, and a certain kind of existential fear, I think, and dread that many are experiencing. I think in the forefront of many of our minds is the unfolding war in Israel and Gaza, and really frighteningly devastating death toll in Gaza, along with the horror of the attacks in Israel that preceded it. It's a humanitarian crisis unfolding in real time, but I'm sure, as many of you know, it's not the only place in the world where there's really, really difficult things happening. War in many places, hunger, refugee crisis, not to mention the sort of larger ecological crisis or the political situation here and abroad that's very disconcerting. So there's a lot of difficult things to talk about with a lot of intensity. So I want to speak a little bit about how we can have conversations that matter and that are meaningful with so much intensity and pain in our lives and in our world. And I think the first thing I want to acknowledge is that when it comes to such difficult and intense topics, the energy and the emotion tends to run very high, particularly around political things. These are tied to deep needs for belonging, for safety, for identity and worldview. These are aspects of ourself and our experience that don't shift easily. And challenging somebody on their views or their beliefs in this way many times can feel like an attack on one's sense of self, which then stimulates the sympathetic nervous system and the fight, flight, freeze response, so people can respond quite vehemently or forcefully, and it makes it difficult to engage in a meaningful way. In particular, with the war in the Middle East, as we know, there are generations of trauma that are feeding into this, personally, historically. So the intensity of the feelings and the reactivity is very high. When trauma is present, the tendency biologically is to center our own experience, our own pain, our own fear. And there's a certain lack of choice about how we engage relationally when we're hypervigilant, which makes it very difficult to entertain other points of view or express ourselves in constructive ways. So this is the context. And I think it's very important to bear this in mind as we consider having conversations. At the same time, I think we can recognize the importance of dialogue. The tension, the differences are already there. Not naming it, not having the conversation isn't going to help. One important aspect of social change is sharing our views with those close to us, with our family, with our friends, with our community, particularly with people with whom we don't see eye to eye. And whether we look back at the civil rights movement, at the women's movement, the anti-war movement, the gay rights movement, what seemed like intractable positions can shift in a culture over time, in part through individual connections and conversations. And so the intense emotion and the violence around the Middle East is another example of this, and one that we're living through right now. So one aspect of this is perhaps sharing our own views in a way that others can hear, but perhaps more importantly also helping people feel heard and understood, so that there's more openness to actually engaging with other points of view. I read an article in the New York Times, might have been today, I think, or yesterday, about two people in the United States who had different views on the war in the Middle East and trying to hear each other. And the article ended on a very somewhat depressing and disappointing note, this sense of like, not being able to hear each other, and did it make any difference, and does it matter? And I think it is really possible to have different kinds of conversations. We can train ourselves to find balance when we're triggered, to stay connected to our deeper intentions in a difficult conversation, to hear the goodness behind other people's words, even when we disagree with them, and also to set limits with love and with care in a way that doesn't damage a relationship or alienate others. So I want to talk tonight about 4 different areas of training ourselves for having difficult conversations, and then go through some key tools for each. So I'm just going to bring up a slide here. So I'll say each of the 4, and then I'll talk some about each of them. Preparing inwardly for the conversation, reflecting on our purpose and our values, rehearsing for the conversation, and then building certain key tools for actually having the conversation. So let's talk about preparing for a conversation, particularly if we're entering a conversation with really charged emotions or difficult topics. One of the best ways we can create the conditions for a meaningful conversation that's productive is to do our own work internally to heal and prepare for the conversation. So this might mean, in many instances, getting a lot of empathy ourselves, finding someone who can listen to us however we want to express ourselves and offer understanding, so that we feel heard, understood, so that we clarify what's going on for us, so that we deactivate internally. Sometimes with a really difficult situation, there might be strong emotions we need to process. I know for many, with what's happening in the Middle East, there's a lot of pain, fear, grief, and mourning. It's difficult to have a conversation through the intensity of those emotions. So the more we can prepare and process some of that grief, some of that intensity, some of that pain, the more we can start from a place of being clear and grounded and resourced. Really important question to ask ourselves before a conversation is, are we actually ready to listen to each other? Given the deep trauma that's being experienced by so many people around the world in relation to what's happening, one of the things that I think is needed is just for spaces for individuals to feel heard and understood before there can be any dialogue across differences. So this is some of the inner work of preparing and healing ourselves that is so essential. And there are many other tools we can draw on for this, but just making time and space for it, I think, is important. Next is a certain kind of orienting to the conversation by reflecting on our purpose and our values. There are many different kinds of conversations we can have. If we're not clear about our purpose, chances are the conversation might not go in the direction we want. So taking some time to identify, what are your goals? And there can be more than one goal for a conversation, but the clearer we are about our purpose going into a conversation, the more we can try to create the conditions for that to happen. So for example, is this a conversation whose aim is healing? Are we just trying to hear one another? Is it a conversation where we're trying to do that in both directions or just in one direction? Is one of your purposes in the conversation to try to influence someone else's views, their choices or behavior? That's a different kind of conversation. If so, what will support that? And I'll talk some more about that as we go further. It's important to ask oneself, how relevant is it to build relationship and trust in the conversation? How much does that exist already? If it doesn't, or if it's strained, how much attention is needed to give to that in order to create the conditions for the kind of conversation we want to have? How much of this conversation is not about the relationship or hearing one another, but is about honoring your own integrity? Say, drawing a line or speaking out, not being complicit, by being silent about something, cutting through the tension of what's known as negative peace, this kind of avoidance of conflict or disagreement to keep the harmony, but there's actually a certain tension and loss of vitality in that. So as we begin to identify more clearly our purpose and our goals in the conversation, the next piece that emerges is, what are the values I'm bringing to this conversation that I want to stay connected to and that I want to animate how I show up and engage? What are the intentions that will be most helpful to guide me in this conversation? For example, do I want to keep coming back to a stance of listening and trying to understand? Is patience something that's going to be helpful or important for me in this conversation? Or is it more courage, feeling my strength, finding my voice? So whatever you identify as, say, your intention or a certain value that you want to stay connected to, again, it can be helpful to prepare by strengthening your experience and your connection to that intention or value. So one way of doing this is by meditating on the intention or the value and bringing to mind a memory, an image, a phrase, something that represents and embodies that intention or value for you. And then really feeling it, sensing it, taking it in, so that in the conversation you can just remember that word, that phrase, that image, and come back to the intention. So, for example, let's say your intention is to listen. You really want to create space and offer a kind of sort of wise and gracious listening to the other person. Maybe you think about Thich Nhat Hanh or the Dalai Lama or Mother Teresa and their capacity for compassion and listening. Or maybe it's an image of nature. Maybe it's the image of a great old tree that stood for centuries, that connects you with the steadiness and the patience of really listening. So you find what works for you. But strengthen that connection and feel that experience so that it's there for you when you need it in the moment. Okay, so we've talked about these two parts of preparing for the conversation, some of the inner healing work, and then clarifying your purpose, your values, and any intention that's going to support you in the conversation. I just want to pause and just see, is this all making sense? Is this resonating for folks? Yeah, okay. All right. You know, I think I'm just going to make a sort of overarching comment here. I think central to this whole theme we're exploring and that I'm offering with you tonight is just the recognition that communication and conversations is a skill that we can develop. And the more time and energy and attention and effort we put in to preparing, the better off we're going to be. And like anything else, there are certain conditions that need to be present for the outcome we want to have. So attending to those conditions is what I'm suggesting here. All right, so the next area of focus is something that can feel a little bit awkward or, I don't know, surprising perhaps, but it's rehearsing. So actually practice having the conversation. It's best to do this with another person if you can, not the person you're going to have the conversation with, but someone else, in a kind of like role play, almost theatrically. But, you know, if you don't have somebody else to have the conversation with, make a sock puppet or look in the mirror. And you can imagine what the other person might say. You can hear it in your mind. And practice. What is it that you want to get across? You know, are there key phrases of things that you want to say? Know your tendencies. Where are you likely to get tripped up in the conversation? What's going to activate you? And how will you handle that? How will you respond when difficult comments are made by the other person? Are you able to find your ground, to regroup, to take a deep breath and let the sort of wave of reactivity or defensiveness come wash through you instead of acting on it. The more we practice with that, the more likely we are to be able to do it in the conversation. So if this is an important conversation to you, if it's one that you want to go well or you want to increase the chances of it going well, practice. Take time to do that ahead of time. Okay. I see that there are numbers on the chat. Somebody opened it up. That's fine. But just so you know, I'm not looking at the chat. So if you're asking me questions, if you're telling me you love it, if you're criticizing me and saying I hate it, that's okay. But I'm not reading it right now because I'm speaking to you, just so you know. All right, let's talk about some of the key tools that I want to share with you. This is really the heart of the matter. And I'm going to read through the list first just to give you an overview. Then I'll take the slide down and talk about each one. So creating supportive structures for the conversation can be very helpful. Letting go of the outcome in the actual conversation. Cultivating curiosity and expressing it by asking questions and reflecting back what you're hearing. Taking things slowly. Can do this by chunking information in manageable bits, focusing on one thing at a time. Seeking common ground or agreement wherever you can. And sharing personal stories. I think that's the last bullet here, yeah. So I want to talk about each of these, and maybe I can just also drop this list in the chat for those who are enjoying the chat or wanting to use it. There you go. So create supportive structures. What does this mean? Usually in our day-to-day life, we have conversations in a kind of free-form, organic way. It's like jazz. We're just sort of exploring spontaneously. For difficult conversations, for intense conversations, it can be helpful to have some scaffolding, to make some agreements ahead of time about how we're going to have the conversation. So this could be something as simple as agreeing to take turns speaking and setting a timer. Like, I'll talk for 5 minutes and then you talk for 5 minutes. It could be breaking the conversation down into parts. If you know there's a lot of ground you want to cover, so you say, well, let's talk tonight for 45 minutes. And I'll just listen to you and try to understand your views and feelings and experience. And I'll ask questions and I'll listen. I'm not going to share my responses. And then tomorrow you'll listen to me for 45 minutes and do the same, right? It doesn't mean we're not going to mess up and get defensive or try to say something. But if we've made that agreement ahead of time, when we move outside of that boundary, we now have two subjectivities, two awarenesses to bring us back on track and say, hey, wait, we agreed we were going to do it this way. Let's come back to focus here. You might make agreements about what topics you're going to cover and what topics you're not going to cover. I watched a documentary a few weeks ago about the Oslo Accords, peace process in the Middle East in the 90s and the early 2000s that never came to fruition for a variety of reasons. But there's many very powerful moments in the movie, and one that really stood out to me was early in the dialogues that led to the Oslo Accords, when the first parties from each side of the PLO and Israel were meeting. Two of the key players who had both grown up in Israel and Palestine had a very painful conversation about the different narratives of the past. And they agreed that night, because it was so painful and inflaming, that they would avoid talking about the past. They said, let's never talk about the past again and only focus on the future. Because that was their purpose, was to reach an agreement for how to live in peace together. And they said, that topic is not going to get us there. So this is an example of an agreement that we can make in a conversation to stay focused on our purpose and work together towards it. The next tool is often counterintuitive, and this is to let go of the outcome. Particularly if your goal is to have influence or to change somebody's views in a certain way, Change happens slowly, and it often requires time, more than one conversation. The more you try to focus narrowly on getting to a certain point or an outcome, that creates tension in the relational space, and it leads to certain ways of relating and certain intentions that erode trust and that block understanding. On the other hand, if you focus more on how you're engaging and building understanding rather than changing someone's mind, you create the conditions for beginning to hear one another and have more leverage. See if there's anything else I want to say on this. Letting go of the outcome doesn't mean we give up on what's important to us. It means that we temporarily are putting that down in order to be present with the human being in front of us and with what is unfolding and true in the moment, which is unpredictable, which is messy, which is confusing. If we're constantly introducing our agenda to that, we miss all kinds of possibilities to connect, to have insight into one another, to see the human being, to find common ground that we didn't know was there. So letting go of the outcome doesn't mean we give up on what's important to us. It just means we're creating a certain space to explore while still holding fast to whatever your values are or your goal is, but not pushing it. Of course, there are different phases of a conversation and a relationship, and there's a time to bring one's purpose or request forward, but I'm talking about more this exploration phase of a relationship and conversation. So the next tools are around curiosity. One of the best ways to build trust is to ask personal, open-ended questions about others. Questions create safety, they show respect, they contribute to understanding, they can elicit empathy and valuable information. So can you come from a genuine intention to understand? Genuine, not performative, not manipulative, to truly understand the human being in front of you. And then ask questions and then listen to what they say. Listen and try to understand it. One way of doing that is to offer some kind of verbal reflection of what you're hearing. The premise here is that underneath everything we do and say as human beings are certain underlying shared universal needs or values. That part of what makes us human is that we all want to be understood, to be seen, to live in peace, to raise our children, to have safety and education. These are things that we can recognize in one another because of our shared humanity. So to listen for those things and to actively offer back to the person what we're understanding, either by summarizing it, by getting to the heart or the essence of what's been said, and ask follow-up questions, which then furthers the relationship. It's really important to note here that empathizing with someone, trying to understand them, doesn't mean that we agree. It doesn't mean we agree with their views. It doesn't mean we agree with their interpretation of events. It doesn't mean that we support or condone their actions. It means that we can understand and honor the human experience they are having, the feelings and the needs that are driving them. This capacity to get curious, to show respect, to listen and truly try to understand is deeply transformative. One of the stories I tell in my first book, Say What You Mean, is a story of an African-American blues musician named Daryl Davis, who grew up abroad, moved to the United States when he was about 10, was playing in the jazz band, marching in the street, and people started throwing bottles and food at him because he was the only black kid in the band. And he didn't understand what was happening. Somebody had to explain to him later about racism because he hadn't experienced it outside of the United States before. And his response, having not grown up and been infected with the disease of racism, was, how can they hate me if they don't know me? And he was able to stay connected to the beauty and potency of that question into his adult life, such that when he met a member of the KKK at a gig in Maryland many years later, he struck up a conversation with him, and through many conversations actually became friends with him, and got really, really interested in the Klan in that particular area, and started interviewing members of the Klan for a book. And he got into some dicey situations, but managed to stay safe. But through the power of his relationships, through the genuineness of his curiosity and his intention to understand and his kindness, he built real relationships, such that more than 200 members of the Klan gave up their membership. The whole organization collapsed in that region through the relationships that he built. So this is just one example of the power of this intention to understand and our genuine curiosity. Of course, there are other considerations and factors in that story. It's not the work of African Americans to heal white supremacy and white violence. That's our work as white identified people. So it's just that's more of a sort of contextual point of the story. But nonetheless, the power of that human connection stands. So we've talked about creating supportive structures, letting go of the outcome, getting curious. Next, take it slowly. It's easy to get activated in difficult conversations. Things move quickly. We begin talking over one another. The more we can slow things down, first by just regulating our own nervous system, the more chance we have of actually having the conversation we want. So this means using the skills of mindfulness, feeling your body, breathing. If you can, try to speak at a pace that is well regulated. In order to do that, you have to slow your breathing, and when you slow your breathing, you regulate your nervous system. When you're speaking, use a skill that's called chunking. Just share one thing. Don't share the whole paragraph, just share one sentence. And take things one step at a time. The more you do that, the more you can check that you're both on the same page and hearing one another. Another thing that happens in difficult conversations is before you finish one topic, another topic gets introduced, and before you finish that one, there's a third and a fourth, and all of a sudden it's a big mess. There's a whole maze. So try to stay focused on one thing at a time. If another topic comes up, acknowledge it. It's important. Let's stay with this one until we're finished with it. So try to stay focused and redirect as needed. Within this process of listening, of taking it slow, look for areas of agreement, however small. Any kind of common ground. Look for things you can agree with, the values or needs behind someone's statement, the hopes they have, the outcome they're wanting. And anytime there's any sense of common ground or mutuality, highlight it, name it, celebrate it. Those are strengths. That's gold to not overlook. So even if it's, wow, this is really hard. Yeah, it is, connecting on that level, acknowledging it, right? Or, I'm just feeling like kind of hopeless and frustrated in this moment. That look on your face, it sounds like you're feeling the same way. Yes, here we are both trying and we're not hearing each other. There's common ground there. We're sharing that experience. So framing things in terms of the we, both of us, and the things that we are experiencing or the things that we can see eye to eye on or agree on is really essential. Finally, share personal stories. Rather than going into facts or making moralistic statements, there's more room for connection when we speak personally. Share your stories. In particular, if you're wanting to influence somebody, how your own views have changed over time. This is often a way of introducing new ideas in a non-threatening manner. Ask people to see things from a personal level. To imagine their family member, their child, their mother, their grandparent in that situation and how it would be for them. This is where change happens, when it's personal, when we can feel it, when we have a connection. And finally, if you've had a discussion, if you have both shared and you've taken time, thank people. Thank them for their time. Thank them for their energy. Thank them for their willingness to engage. That keeps the door open for future dialogues. I also want to acknowledge that there are times where we might need to set limits. We might need to gracefully exit a conversation, to say no. When we've reached our capacity, we can't listen anymore. It's probably better to stop the conversation than to pretend or try to keep going and do more damage. So when we need to set a limit like that, we want to do it in a way that creates as least harm and disconnection as possible in order to maintain the relationship or some mutual respect. And so, acknowledging whatever has been said, trying to affirm some sense of the other person or where they're coming from, and then sharing whatever it is for you that's your limit. I'm glad we're having this conversation and that you feel comfortable sharing your views with me. And I don't think I can go on hearing what you just said because it's too upsetting for me. And then don't stop there. Offer something. Can we come back to this tomorrow? Or I might be willing to continue if we can pause here and you can just hear how that affects me and why I'm so upset. So if you're going to say no, if you're going to set a limit, don't just stop there. Try to suggest something for what could happen next, even if it's, I'm going to take a break and I'll get in touch in a couple days and let you know what I want to do from here. But don't just leave it hanging by offering something, again, that continues the whatever goodwill you've built in the conversation. I think I want to end with a quote from Shimon Peres, who took over from, am I blanking on the Prime Minister's name, who was involved in the Oslo Accords before, Rabin, Yitzhak Rabin, after he was assassinated. This is from the last interview done with Shimon Peres. The interviewer asked him, do you still believe there's a chance for peace between Jews, Israelis, and the Palestinians? I don't think there's another alternative, neither for the Palestinians nor for us. The only alternative is an ongoing war. But contrary to what people think, in war, there are no victories, only victims. No war is ever finished unless it's being replaced by peace.